Good evening. Welcome to the launch of CAPRI's first report for 2023, The Business of Care, Boosting Productivity by Supporting Workers' Care Obligations. My name is Diana Thorburn and I'm the Director of Research at the Caribbean Policy Research Institute. CAPRI is an independent public policy think tank devoted to evidence-based research in the areas of the economy, governance, the environment, and social issues. Our mission is to contribute to improved, evidence-informed public policy in these areas in Jamaica and the Caribbean. This report is the penultimate one in the EU-funded project, Civil Society Organizations as Actors of Governance and Development, and is the second of 3 groundbreaking studies in the area of the care economy. The European Union has remained our steadfast partner throughout our 15 years of existence, as it continues to work with Jamaica and the region in its developmental goals, and we are grateful for their ongoing support. The report being launched this evening follows on from the report launched last October, Who Cares? The Real Cost of Unpaid Care and Domestic Work, which, for the first time in Jamaica and the English-speaking Caribbean, put a value to the unpaid care and domestic work done by Jamaicans. That value was an astonishing 15 to 45% of GDP, depending on the method of valuation. This study picks up from that finding to delve further into the business case for the care economy, how that notional value of unpaid care and domestic work can be translated into real economic value by exploring how employers, businesses, and the public sector can use the knowledge of the intersection between workers' unpaid care obligations and worker productivity to improve their outputs, whether they be for profit or public services. I am particularly proud of this and CAPRI's other work on the care economy, dating back to our very first study in 2018. While the topic is not yet well understood in Jamaica, it is one of the most important policy issues in contemporary social and economic development discourse, with implications for government, the private sector, employer and employee stakeholders, and all who are interested in equitable and sustainable economic growth. Jamaica is well positioned to move forward with progressive care economy policies for several reasons, as the report will make clear. The format of this evening's proceedings is as follows. An EU representative will bring greetings. We will then have a presentation of the report and its main findings by CAPRI Research Assistant Ronaldo Blake, who worked with the research team that put this report together. Following the presentation, we will move into a discussion with a panel of experts who will delve deeper into the findings of the report and discuss its implications for policy and practice in Jamaica. They are the President of the Caribbean Employers Confederation, Mr. Wayne Chen, and Senior Director at the Jamaica Productivity Center, Ms. Michaela Ann Urquhart. This superb panel will be moderated by CAPRI's Director of Strategy, Yentel Williams. Yentel was also a member of the research team for this report, as was Shanna K. Chisholm, Priya Alexander, as well as yours truly. We invite you, our virtual audience, to participate in the discussion by submitting your questions online using Slido. To do so, visit slido.com and enter the event code CAPRI, after which you will have the option to post questions or upvote other questions you would like our panelists to respond to. I now welcome Mr. Aniceto Rodriguez Ruiz, Head of Cooperation of the European Union Delegation to Jamaica, to give remarks about the report and this evening's proceedings.
Good evening and welcome to this web forum for the launch of the report, The Business of Care, Boosting Productivity by Supporting Workers' Care Obligations. With this, we have reached the 8th research prepared by CAPRI with the financial support of the European Union as part of the project Civil Society Organizations as Actors of Governance and Development. The project aims to improve governance and accountability by stimulating policy innovation and enhancing policy responsiveness in the areas of women's empowerment, youth advocacy, and economic inclusion. European Union support to civil society organizations and academia aims to help them to be the voice of the marginalized by stimulating public debate and giving voice to the concerns of vulnerable people. the initiatives that they undertake can contribute to good governance and accelerate progress on gender equality. This is the second report in this series focusing on important aspects of the care economy that it's increasingly recognized to play an important role in transforming and modernizing our development model to make it more efficient and more sustainable. Strengthening care systems and services helps to create more favorable conditions for further investments, for growth and for sustainability. It can result in new employment and more income and inclusion for disadvantaged social sectors. In this effort, the European Union and Jamaica are both guided by the Target 5.4 of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, aiming to recognize and value unpaid care and domestic work, and to tackle persistent gender inequalities as a necessary foundation for inclusive growth and development. In Jamaica, Vision 2030 National Development Plan already recognizes the link between unpaid care work and paid productive work, giving particular attention to child and elderly care. Similarly, in the European Union, the Gender Equality Strategy for 2020-2025 identifies closing gender gaps in caring roles as a priority. As of August 2022, all EU member states must apply EU-wide rules to improve work-life balance for parents and carers, setting out minimum standards for paternity, parental, and care leave. They also have to establish additional rights, such as the right to request flexible working arrangements, which will help people develop their careers and their family life without having to sacrifice either of both. From the previous CAPRI research report supported by the EU, launched the past October, we already learned the great value of care and domestic work that, paid or unpaid, sustains our societies. Today, this new report will help us to explore the unpaid care work productivity nexus in Jamaica with a view to exploring the options for employer-provided support for workers with care obligations. I'm convinced that this report can help Jamaica policy makers, private sectors, citizens, and the EU as a partner of Jamaica in the development process to be more aware of the issues at stake. It provides useful recommendations for initiatives that can immediately be undertaken by government and private companies. Then now, it's time to leave the floor to researchers, to panelists, to guide us through the findings, conclusions, and recommendations of this interesting report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and welcome to our audience online. We are very pleased to have you here with us tonight for a very important discussion on how employers can support their employees with care responsibilities in Jamaica. Thank you to Diana and Aniceto for that introduction. Shortly, I'll be joined by Wayne Chen, President of the Caribbean Employers Confederation, and Michael Ann Urquhart, the Senior Director at the Jamaican Productivity Center at the Ministry of Labour and Social Security. But before that, I invite you, our audience, to go to slido.com and enter the event code CAPRI. There you can respond to our poll and also ask your questions. You can also upvote questions by other audience members, and we will respond to them during the panel discussion. For now, let's have a brief discussion from Ronaldo Blake, CAPRI's researcher, who will give a brief presentation of the report.
Globally, 42% of women and 6% of men cannot get jobs because they have care responsibilities. In Jamaica alone, over 15,000 women were out of the labor force because they're caring for someone else. But evidence shows that when employers support workers with care duties, business and personal outcomes improve. This report explores a connection between paid work and unpaid care work and employer support for workers doing this balancing act. Let's start by defining the care economy. The care economy is that sector of the economy that is responsible for providing services that contribute to nurturing and reproducing current and future populations. It includes childcare, elder care, education, healthcare, and personal, social, and domestic services that are provided in both paid and unpaid forms within formal and informal sectors. Both men and women do invaluable care work in our societies. However, the gender division of labor, or how work is traditionally distributed between men and women, means that women spend twice as much time in unpaid work than men do. In Jamaica, women spend over 4 hours a day doing unpaid care and domestic work and just under 3 hours a day in paid work, while men spend under 2 hours a day doing unpaid care and domestic work and 4.5 hours doing paid work. The ILO estimates that across 64 countries, unpaid care work amounts to at least 9% of global GDP, or 11 trillion US dollars. Jamaica aligns with global trends. CAPRI's study, Who Cares? The Real Cost of Unpaid Care and Domestic Work, puts the most conservative estimate for unpaid care and domestic work at 15% of GDP. By other measures, it could be as much as 45% of GDP. The people doing this unpaid work must balance the time and energy they devote to meeting their dependents' needs on one hand, and their ability to do formal work on the other hand. This intersection is referred to as the unpaid care work productivity nexus. The unpaid care work productivity nexus has implications for workers with care obligations as well as their employers. Workers who participate in paid labor and unpaid care duties are more stressed, less productive, and face greater job uncertainty than men and women without care responsibilities. The outcomes for them are compromised mental and physical health, job instability, poor economic well-being, and lower quality for their children's care. This results in poor worker output, weak worker morale, and high job turnover for employers. Some women remain outside the labor force altogether to take up the role of nurturing. In 2020, 15,700 Jamaican women were out of the labor force to stay with dependents, while the number for men was negligible. It is well established that the most effective way to support women to participate in formal labor markets is by providing access to reliable, affordable, and high-quality childcare services. This helps women secure a balance between caring for their children, doing paid work, and taking care of their own well-being. A lack of these kinds of supportive measures comes at a societal cost, which includes gender and socioeconomic inequality and reduced social progress. A woman who cannot afford to pay for care often chooses between caring for her dependents and working. In the first case, she and her dependents suffer financially, and in the second case, her dependents remain without adequate care. The business proposition for the care economy is to consider it as a potential market and employment generator by facilitating and promoting the migration of some share of informal care services to the formal economy. This approach is based on the premise that if these activities and the labor they require remain in the non-market economy, then there is a misallocation of productive resources whereby persons with non-care qualifications are obliged to do care work. Globally, the ILO estimates that formalizing the care economy would create nearly 300 million jobs by 2035. This figure includes 96 million direct jobs in childcare, 136 million direct jobs in long-term care, and 67 million indirect jobs in non-care sectors. Marketizing some portion of the at least 340 billion Jamaican dollars in unpaid care work done locally into paid care services would entail formalizing care work and distributing it among people who can do it for a wage. Formalization would increase GDP by nearly 17% and represent a nearly equal boost to national productivity. In countries like Sweden and Mexico, governments support workers with paid parental leave, tax credits to offset the costs of child rearing, and high-quality state-provided daycare. These measures enable more women to work and simultaneously create formal employment opportunities for care economy workers. By contrast, the United Nations notes that very few measures have been put in place by Caribbean governments to reduce the unpaid care work burden. In fact, Barbados is the only English-speaking Caribbean country with state-provided daycare. In Jamaica, the Flexible Work Arrangements Act of 2014 serves as a starting point for employers willing to improve the balance between people's paid work and unpaid care work. However, the law's opportunities have not been widely utilized by Jamaican employers, including in the public sector. Nonetheless, the government has taken progressive steps relevant to workers' unpaid care work obligations. There was an expansion of provisions for parental leave for public sector workers, which included an increase of maternity leave from 40 to 60 days and the introduction of leave for fathers of newborn children and adoptive parents who are bringing a new child into the home. Though it was not an explicit aim of the policy, these measures should encourage the increased co-responsibility of care work between working men and women and reduce the household gender inequality. There are no other laws or formal state-mandated mechanisms to specifically support workers with care needs in Jamaica. Commitments to investing in social infrastructure to support workers' care needs are regularly made by state officials, but they lack implementation. Private sector employers stand to gain from supporting their employees with care obligations. An international financial corporation study of 10 multinational companies that provide employer-supported childcare found that these companies all benefited from improved recruitment, retention, productivity, diversity, access to markets, and worker satisfaction and well-being. In one of our international case studies, National Foods Limited in Pakistan increased women workers by 65% and women managers by 117%, and also observed a maternity return rate of 100% over a 2-year period after implementing several initiatives to support their working parents. This study also explored existing care support initiatives offered by private sector employers. A best case example is the National Commercial Bank, which has a fully equipped early childhood development center with trained staff for 145 children aged 0 to 6 years old. The bank also provides vouchers to subsidize the cost of daycare and nursery for staff whose children do not attend the company's nursery. Moreover, NCB has a fully equipped recreational center with sporting facilities and recreational activities to promote holistic staff wellness. Other Jamaican employers voluntarily support workers with benefits such as on-site childcare and education for children of employees, subsidies for childcare or school fees, flexible working hours, emergency family time off, and even paternity leave. While instructive, these benefits are far from universal, and there is no government intervention mandating, supporting, or incentivizing the private sector to offer them. Government interventions can include legislation mandating certain types of family leave or childcare support, tax credits for private sector employers, and state-led programs that provide employers with training, subsidies, and certification for on-site children's facilities. We conducted a survey among people aged 20 to 40 years old in the Kingston and Montego Bay metropolitan areas. We wanted to know how workers correlate their unpaid care needs and their ability to perform optimally in the workplace. The findings confirm what is found in the literature. Care responsibilities are a heavy burden to persons who do paid work. Moreover, the productivity, focus, and job satisfaction of workers are hampered by burdensome care obligations, which could be relieved by employer-provided support. There was a direct impact of COVID-19 on unpaid care work, which fell mainly on women. In the United States, women's labor participation hit a 33-year low in January 2021, and mothers of children under 13 were 3 times more likely than fathers to lose jobs. Tellingly, a third of all women who stopped working quoted childcare problems as the reason. On the bright side, the pandemic also served as a catalyst for employee support programs such as FlexiTime and work from home. One local employer reported that post-pandemic, the corporate aspect of their large entity moved to a 4-day work week and continued with online meetings. Unfortunately, however, other positive changes, such as a shorter workday, were not kept. Jamaica is experiencing historically low unemployment, and there's a need for workers in several sectors in the economy. In this environment, providing care support can gain employers an advantage in attracting and retaining employees. Employers that provide care benefits will not only differentiate themselves from the competition, but will also create a sticky benefit that fosters retention. That is, employees are less likely to move to a new job if it also means moving their childcare from an environment they trust. There was a consensus among interviewees that the state needs to do more regarding workers' unpaid care obligations. It can set the standard within the public sector and also create an enabling environment for the private sector to follow. Full implementation of flexi-work policies for public sector workers is an example of low-hanging fruit for the government. Another avenue for government support is the community care facilities that are a social good benefiting the entire society. An extensive informal system already exists, but these need to be formalized and better regulated to meet a basic minimum standard. Existing facilities, such as Social Development Commission community centers, have received criticism for not having the adequate budget and thus failing to provide the intended support. Additionally, stakeholders indicated that the care needs of elderly dependents deserve urgent attention due to demographic changes. From one stakeholder's perspective, senior resource centers could be places for healthy and productive aging, which also contributes to economic development. Let's now take a moment to consider our options. We offer 3 recommendations for government and 1 for the private sector. The government should pursue full implementation of the Flexi-Work Act, particularly within the public sector. It should also follow through on commitments to invest in the care economy, which will include formalization of more care centers. Finally, the government should incentivize private employers to support their workers with care obligations. Meanwhile, the private sector entities should research the most context-appropriate tools to support workers with a view to introducing them in local companies. Formalization and support of unpaid care work has the potential to create millions of jobs and substantially increase productivity globally and locally. While both men and women will benefit, women stand to gain at the same time as gender inequality would be reduced and families strengthened. Many local employers already have measures supporting workers with their care duties, but those are largely insufficient, and more is required from government in setting and executing the standard. In any given policy domain, there are brief periods, the policy windows, where an alignment can be perceived between political conditions, a specific problem at hand, and the existence of a policy idea that could provide an effective solution to that problem. Given global trends, previously iterated commitments and recent policy moves, and employer enthusiasm for the idea, Jamaica has a policy window to adopt the care economy recommendations and support the women and men who walk the tightrope of balancing their duty to care for relatives and their professional ambitions.
Thank you, Ronaldo. That overview has shown what we already know. Productivity suffers when workers are not supported with their care needs. And the data in the report clearly shows highlights a very rich overview of how that productivity suffers when care needs are not met. Care One has already showed that the Jamaican economy could benefit by 15 to 45% of GDP if there was support to the care economy. And this raises policy questions around how can the unpaid care burden be relieved or minimized, and what is the role of employers in this regard. We are very privileged to be joined today by 2 experts in the field, one from the public sector and one from the private sector. I'm very pleased to welcome Michaela Ann Urquhart, Senior Director at the Jamaican Productivity Center at the Ministry of Labour and Social Security, and Wayne Chen, President of the Caribbean Employers Confederation. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Michaela. I'd love to start with you. Could you tell us a bit more about the centre? What is the Jamaican Productivity Centre, and what is your role in advising the government with regards to productivity?
First of all, I'd like to say thank you to CAPRI for having us and making us a part of this launch. This study is very important in raising awareness about issues relating to productivity, something that is needed now more than ever for Jamaica, where we're trying to do whatever we can to look at issues to boost productivity. The Jamaica Productivity Center is there for that reason as well. The center is a department in the Ministry of Labor and Social Security. We are tasked with monitoring, understanding, evaluating productivity, and supporting private and public sector entities to try and boost their productivity by implementing productivity best practices. We offer services to our clients that would include customized audits, consultations, workshops. We also engage in research and knowledge management that will help to understand national productivity, even at the firm level as well. And this goes across the public and the private sectors. And we also advocate for programs and policies that will support productivity that will be sustainable so that we can have improved standard of living, increase our GDP, and be more competitive globally.
Thank you. And Wayne, could you tell us a bit more about the Caribbean Employers Confederation?
The Caribbean Employers Confederation is a grouping of 17 national employers organizations throughout the English and Dutch-speaking Caribbean. And we play a regional role and national roles, working closely hand in hand under a tripartite arrangement with the labor movement and the different governments. One, to advance the ILO's decent work agenda. Two, to look at national and regional development. And three, to follow up on Michaela Ann's comments, to boost productivity, competitiveness, economic growth, and social development in the region. We see working together in a form of social dialogue to achieve these goals as being the most efficient way to get there.
Thank you. I'm very keen to now delve into both your perspectives on productivity in Jamaica and specifically the link it has with the care economy. Michaela Ann, from your perspective, what is the status quo on productivity? How can we boost it? And is there any, well, having heard the data, what is the potential link with the care economy in Jamaica?
So first off, to say that productivity in Jamaica, there's a lot of opportunities available. The status quo is that where we're experiencing low productivity growth. This is not uncommon to trends that we see across the globe, where factors such as changes in education and technology, reduction in the rate of trade has weakened productivity growth overall. But what we're seeing in Jamaica, unfortunately, is that there is the case where our productivity growth is actually falling behind a lot of our counterparts, both regionally and globally. And in some cases, and many years, we see that we're actually declining in our productivity growth. This can stem from a number of reasons that would include how we conduct our businesses in terms of our ability to formalize inclusion or a limited amount of inclusion, issues related to traffic. All these factors can lower productivity. So our goal will be to improve our productivity is to try and find a way to have higher value output, right? So that's in our goods and our services. And a part of that is supporting our workforce to ensure that we have a workforce that can meaningfully contribute and be a part of that goal. Unpaid care work is one of those things. Now, with the Productivity Center, we have a forward-looking mission to be more human-centered in our approaches to improving productivity for our nation. This would include ensuring that there's a holistic, improved well-being amongst our population. Issues with unpaid care work are very important to us, and this study raises the need in that when we look at unpaid care work, we realize that it's not necessarily even or equal across all segments of population, looking across different industries. So, for example, if you were to compare agriculture, the last estimates that I have for April to June of last year, 2022, we would have seen that there was, on average, the output per worker was $93,000, and that's over a 3-month period. Whereas if you look in an area like electricity or even finance, you would have seen that output per worker would have been upwards of $500,000 per person. And so when you look at those statistics, you realize that we also have considerations for where persons are employed and how they're hired to determine whether or not we can make roads to actually trying to encourage persons to engage in more paid care work. Also, there's demographic issues as it relates to unpaid care work, in that we now see a higher percentage of women compared to males completing higher education. And this puts a strain in terms of women's ability or decisions to want to have children, and that has implications for future productivity. And then I think finally, before I give Wayne a chance, I would just want to add that in looking at unpaid care work, we also have to remember that there is going to be a trade-off in terms of productivity socially, in terms of the time that parents, not only women, can spend with their children in terms of developing their attitudes towards productivity in future, and also understanding what it means, the difference in attitudes between persons who have to take care of elderly persons versus persons who need care for children.
Thank you for that overview. And Wayne, from the private sector perspective, what is your opinion on this link between the care economy and productivity as it applies to Jamaica in particular?
Michaela Ann has touched on some important themes, and it is the fact that the Jamaican economy, the Jamaican society, is not a homogeneous thing. Output in the agricultural sector versus output in finance is widely varied. So there are other factors we have to take into account if we want to truly understand what we're looking at. The study is an extremely useful piece of work in that it's now adding numbers to what we always knew was out there. We need to now delve a little deeper and see what is it really saying to us. So you used the example earlier of the National Commercial Bank, which I found interesting because I'm pretty familiar with that situation, and there's a lot of learning in that. But the NCBs of the world, the Grace Kennedys of the world, which does a similar thing, and there are other large private sector companies, profitable, big companies that do similar things. And they themselves have had very mixed experiences in terms of how to compensate, how to stimulate, how to really, not incentivize, but to recognize and pay for their workers who have care obligations. But the fact is that more than 80% of our workers work in small and medium-sized enterprises. So this is really an exception rather than a norm in terms of the scale of the enterprise. And we must also consider that almost, I think the figure is around 40% of our workers work in the informal sector versus the formal sector. And this has been a bugbear to something that we as employers, the fact is that when I talk about the tripartite arrangement and the social dialogue and the social contract, the fact is that ourselves and the union, the leaders of the unions and the labor leaders and governments essentially want the same thing. The issue is never the destination. We all want prosperous, well-educated, productive societies, peaceful societies. But when you have these sort of wide disparities, we have to be careful that the policies we implement don't have unintended consequences. So we want a robust social safety net. The employers want it because it reduces the amount of compensation you have to pay workers. So when the cost of education, when the cost of healthcare, when the cost of infrastructure, when the cost of childcare or elderly care is equitably distributed, it does not create a competitive disadvantage or advantage. If you are playing by the rules, if you are in the formal sector, if you're paying all your payroll taxes, if you're doing all the things by the book, by the regulation, it should not become a competitive disadvantage with someone who can not play by the rules with impunity. Or worse, if we are now in a globalized economy, if we are carrying a burden here in Jamaica that is not being carried elsewhere, and it becomes a competitive disadvantage in the global market. So the first thing is, we are all for a robust social safety net to include formalized care, and I'm going to say formalized specifically, because Jamaica has a huge network of informal care, not just in the household. The fact is that we have maybe 3,000 basic schools, and I use the term very loosely in Jamaica. Many of them are basic schools, yes, in terms of early childhood education. But when I was a child, I went to school at age 4. Nowadays, as soon as a child is out of diapers, they go to something called a basic school in the community. And the child is cared for by untrained workers while the parent goes off to work. I touch on 2 important points. The fact is that experience has taught us as employers that having childcare at the point of employment is not the ideal. Having childcare in the community is the ideal. So the parent can drop the child off, get in a taxi or get on a bus and go to work, go home, pick up the child and go home. Trying to centralize, even in the NCB case, you will realize that NCB has over 2,000 workers dispersed across Jamaica. But this facility sounds nice, but it really covers maybe a couple of hundred. Maybe 10% of the workforce is covered by the one facility. Because the NCB experience, and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, is that the typical person prefers childcare near the home rather than near the workplace. So these are things that we have to take into account. So what am I saying here? I'm saying congratulations to CAPRI for a fabulous study. We as employers would love to see more this sort of empirical information and data inform policy making. But policy making has to be realistic in terms of where we are in Jamaica. I'm going to touch again on the whole issue of the basic schools. The issue of basic schools has been around for decades. What am I talking about? The fact is that the typical 4-year-old in Jamaica is in a basic school. 25 years ago, when I first looked at the issue, maybe half or slightly less than half of the number, and at the time it was about 1,800 basic schools, had a trained early childhood teacher. It was a stated objective of government in the 90s that every basic school in Jamaica should have a state-financed early childhood specialist. We still have not achieved that goal 25 years later.
Well, it's so important you mentioned the 90s. Although I was too young to analyse policy at the time, I'm aware that the current Flexi Time, the Employment Act in Jamaica, is a result of discussions that were started in the 90s.
Started in the early 1990s.
Precisely.
And it, I think, got passed in 2014, so it took about 20 years to get.
Precisely. So if discussions have started so long ago and we are at the point of having the legislation, where are we in terms of implementation?
Well, I'll tell you.
And as you say, that it's so important to delve deeper.
Yes.
And on that point, I just wanted to bring in Mikhail Ann here from the public sector perspective. I wanted to hear your opinions about our recommendations. In the interviews we did for this report, often at times it came up that actually the public sector should lead in terms of full implementation. That means that public sector employees themselves should benefit from flexi time, which I understand not to be the case currently. So is there a move towards that? How can we move towards implementing these recommendations? And I also take the point that we need to make sure that these are tailor-made for the different sectors, for the different parts of the Jamaican economy and the Jamaican demographic.
Right. So I think that's one of the great things about the current Flexi Work Time Act, right? It does allow, and it's made in such a way that employers can take on the parts of it that are beneficial to them. So it offers different circumstances for flexi work arrangements in terms of whether you're going to have a different number of number of days that you're allowed to work, whether you're working on weekends, and there are rules that allow for that. So we understand that there are some positions that will require persons to work in office. I think when we look at the flexible work arrangements, definitely we would have seen where, for example, the Jamaica Productivity Center, we did a survey during the time when COVID-19 was in force and we had all those regulations. And a number of persons are indicated that their productivity actually improved because they were able to engage in flexible work arrangements. And the key reasons that they cited for that was the ability to have a work-life balance. And with having that work-life balance, it meant that even for some persons before COVID, they had less distractions at home than when they were in the office. They found that they weren't having to encounter with traffic in terms of having to do drop-offs and then trying to get to work. So to the point of having basic schools in the community rather than at the point of the workplace. Persons also cited the fact that they were able to actually engage more sometimes with their coworkers because it required more coordination and more organization. However, there were instances where persons felt that the flexible work arrangements didn't suit their needs or didn't help their productivity. And the reasons that were cited for that were they weren't adopting or they didn't have the appropriate tools and technology in order for it to work. In many organizations, because of the code restrictions at that point, flexible work arrangements were just implemented on this whole scale, like this one-size-fit-all way. And when that happened, you found that some persons that really and truly couldn't do their work from home were also given the same type of flexible work arrangements. So we have to make sure that it is tailor-made, it's customized. Another issue with the flexible work arrangements is that for persons, although they had increased work-life balance, for persons who actually had children at home or other persons at home that they had to care for, that could have been a source of distraction. So even with flexible work arrangements, when we're talking about uncared work, there still has to be alternatives that will still support persons being able to work from home. So we can't just, so flexible work arrangements are a positive step towards that. In terms of the public sector leading the way, I think the same thing will apply across the public sector. It's not one type of work. It's not the same thing. So it would have to be a systematic approach to see how those can be best served. And also creating public institutions, not necessarily just from the perspective of implementing flexible work for the employees, but the way in which public services are offered. That is also another way in which an approach can be taken to trying to support persons who have all these obligations to take care of. And of course, the public sector has implemented or has the flexible work arrangement that has been passed. And so it's there and it's encouraged for persons to engage in its use and to apply it as appropriate for their specific organizations.
Yes, and Wayne, from the private sector perspective, what is your opinion on the set of recommendations that CAPRI came up with? You've mentioned the formalization of the basic schools, which is a recommendation of ours. We've talked about offering incentives to private sector. I also wondered, in relation to that, how did COVID, the pandemic, impact how we perceive the support that employers provide to employees? And did that natural experiment lead us to a new frontier or new normal?
I've been preaching about this new normal. I've come to realize that it's not a technology issue, it's a mindset issue. And we're going to have to just keep pushing at it. I think it would be remiss of us to not mention the implementation of paternity leave in the public sector, which is a significant move forward. Because our discussion so far has tended to talk about women in doing care work. The fact is that we also have to make opportunities for the men to do care work. I sense a new generation, and maybe this is a study for CAPRI, a new generation of men who want to be more actively engaged, both in the care of their children, but also in the care of elderly. And we do have an aging population. So when we talk about care, we're having fewer children, but we're having more retirees, more people who are no longer able to work. So care, even the nature of care itself is going to be changing. Paternity leave is one step forward, and the public sector has made that bold step forward. Formalization of the care facilities throughout the island, proper monitoring, as you would have seen what came out today with the CPFSA, the very tragic report, that having good oversight and the formalization of these institutions becomes critical. I mentioned a number of 3,000 dispersed across the country. Bringing them up to a certain standard to allow parents to comfortably leave young children, I think should be the next step. There was one other thing, the regulatory and IT infrastructure to support more remote work, more flexi work, I think is a pragmatic way to move forward, to allow more parents to stay home, work from home, and really move more towards that work-life balance, I think would be critical.
Thank you. And now I turn to you, the audience. Please do respond to the poll and ask your questions. I will now take a question from Ambrose, which has been upvoted to the top question currently. Why would businesses pay a worker's daycare costs when they won't even pay their employees properly? So that's a challenging but a really important question posed there. If workers are perceiving that they are inadequately paid, why would the business therefore further invest to support that same worker's care needs?
So,
that's a very rash generalization, because we gave the example of one company that pays. The fact is that the vast majority of Jamaican businesses are not that profitable. It's a competitive market environment. One of the things that a business competes on, or businesses compete on generally, is that if they want the best workers, they offer the best compensation. I can tell you that based on personal experience and the experience of many companies, when they interview, these are the questions that come up. Do you have young children? How will you provide for them? And this is part of the interview discussion. So I can tell you that that comment may pertain to some businesses, but certainly not all. The businesses in Jamaica, and I can state unequivocally, that want the best people, the most productive, the best educated, the most talented, the ones with the skills, this comes into the mix. It already is coming into the mix. We don't have to tell them to do it.
So just to add to that point, I think you raise a very good point, that the companies that are able to, that have the resources, they see it right away, the ability to offer these incentives. I think for maybe those organizations that maybe don't see it immediately, or for persons that don't understand why companies would do it, we also have to look at the fact that persons who don't have a good work-life balance, they carry all of that baggage and that stress with them into the workplace. So you end up with issues like absenteeism and presenteeism, right? So absenteeism is where persons are absent from work because they have to take care of issues relating to health and wellness and their household, financial, things like that. And then you have presenteeism, where persons arrive at work, they're probably on time, but the amount of work that they're doing is a lot less productive because their mind is elsewhere, or they're tired, they're exhausted. They have to run home to do school pickup, or they have to, buy school supplies. So all these little things can actually impact the value to the employer. So then if you're getting less productive work from the employees that you do have, then you're going to find that that could translate into additional costs. So if persons are absent or not doing the work that they have, that could end up looking like overtime for the company, which is usually more expensive than regular time. And then the cost to hire replacements, temporary replacements, can also be very costly. And where persons feel that they can't stay at a job because it's not feasible with the schedule of the persons they have to take care of at home, then it's a matter of high turnover. So those are actually costs that should incentivize companies to want to try and encourage a work-life balance for their employees where they can.
Now we have a question from someone who wishes to remain anonymous. How do we formalize Jamaican forms of informal care unique to Jamaican family idiosyncrasies, that's referring to grandparents, aunts, uncles, a situation that's quite common here in Jamaica. How can that contribute to improved productivity?
The fact is that Jamaica is a free country. And what I say, it's free, people are free to make their own arrangements. It's not everyone that wants their elderly relatives to go into a state-approved care facility, nor do they want their children to go into a state-approved care facility. There are families that will pool the resources. Adults will share the responsibility for multiple children. It's a very common arrangement in Jamaica. And there is no way the state is going to mandate that that must be replaced by a facility. What we are talking about here is the facilities that currently exist and ought to exist to allow for care to be formalized, that they are brought up to a certain standard, that they are regulated and monitored, and where necessary, in fact, in many instances necessary, helped to be brought up to that standard. So it's not a question of doing away with one to create another. It is to allow people more choices, but choices, good choices, not between the mediocre and the bad, or the bad and the very bad, but to ensure that when you leave your child if you are in Smithville, Clarendon, and you go to the ABC basic school and they're taking a 2-year-old, that you can leave the 2-year-old with confidence to know that the place is passed by the health department, that any potential hazards to the child is there, that the adults who are charged with looking after your children are properly trained, they are vetted, you don't have any pedophiles looking after your children. So there are standards that will have to be met and will have to be monitored by state agencies. If people want to make their own private arrangements, which many people do, I will disinherit my children if they put me into a state home, and that is a personal choice, and many people have that attitude. So it's not to one versus the other. It is to ensure that those that are accessible to the public are maintained at a certain standard.
Yeah, I agree with what Wayne Chin has said. He raised a lot of good points to say that it's not necessarily a case that persons shouldn't be allowed to make these arrangements, but the challenge that when we talk about productivity is the fact that we have a lot of persons who have a lot of potentially untapped potential, right? And so if these persons don't have the appropriate skill sets, or they're not given the opportunity to expand their skill sets to work, then this is a lot of times where we have these arrangements because persons are not gainfully employed in some instances, and that's why some of these arrangements occur. There are, of course, persons who choose to have their parents, for example, their grandparents they retire, they can take care of their children, and that's also a good arrangement. But I think we just want to make sure that we have facilities in place so that persons who actually want to be gainfully employed have the opportunity to do so, along with being able to have that social support. And there are systems that have now been implemented. For instance, he indicated on the paternity leave, social pensions plan for elderly persons, NIS and PATH, and all these different programs that will help to support persons who want to have some funds in order to help with their dependent care. So I think it's a mixed issue. Yes, persons have the choice to do that, but I think there's also the possibility and room to discuss how we can get persons in to utilize their skills to the full extent where that's the case.
Thank you. I will take one more question from Slido, and I will use the moderator's privilege of mixing it in with my own final question as we are coming towards the close of this discussion. What would it take for government to put more political will and resources into providing support for workers with care obligations? And where do you both see Jamaica in 2030, bearing in mind the Vision 2030 of the government, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals that should be achieved by 2030?
That's a big question. So I would say that, as I mentioned before, there's clearly a lot of opportunities available here in Jamaica. In terms, I think that there already exists there already exists this push and emphasis on more human-centered approaches to looking at workplace productivity, at looking at how the labor market is informed, making sure that there is more of an emphasis on well-being, work-life balance. So I think that that emphasis already exists. I think as we go forward, looking at what we now call the future of work, which, we say the future of work is already here, but over the next 10 years, it's a matter of taking grasp of those opportunities that will allow us to, I would say, have persons be more aware of the impact that productivity have higher value outputs, to direct our labor resources and other resources to area of higher value added output, so that we can have an increased standard of living. We can see where persons will be able to be more resilient to future shocks, where companies can be more resilient. I think if we are looking on the side of optimism, we can look at the boost in technology and communications, so that we can have not only technology be implemented, but the appropriate technology be implemented at a faster speed, to have the skills in our society match with the needs of the development that we need. So looking at improving that job skill matching and decreasing any mismatches that occur.
Thank you.
I want to say did. No, the fact is, I'm sitting here and, the old African proverb comes to mind, that it takes a village to raise a child. The fact is that here we are 60 years after independence, 61 years now coming up, 49 years after the oil shock of 1974, and you can look at Jamaica's economic and development trajectory since then, that we have struggled economically in terms of finding growth, finding sustained growth over a period. We have gone through a series of macroeconomic instability, high indebtedness, and finally we're seeing some light at the end of the tunnel in terms of now having sufficient fiscal space, and I'm speaking in highfalutin terms. But really cash that we can now invest properly. But I think cash just being invested without some sort of social compact, some understanding of where we want to go to as a country. What are the shared basic minimum of what we need as a society? That social safety net that I said we need to talk about. This has to be a part of it, but it has to come about with an understanding that it must be equitably paid for and equitably distributed.
Well, thank you to both my panelists, Michaela Ann Urquhart, Senior Director at the Jamaica Productivity Center, and Wayne Chen, who is the President of the Caribbean Employers Confederation. Thank you, our audience. Thank you for also agreeing by 80% that employers should take responsibility over employees' care needs. And now I invite Diana Thorburn, Director of Research, for our closing remarks.
Enjoyed and learned, as I did, from that rich discussion about the business case for the care economy in Jamaica. It is a topic that is relatively new to Jamaica, but is of critical importance to our country's development. And as you would have heard, there is a policy window through which Jamaica is well positioned to move forward on the recommendations made here. I extend warm thanks on behalf of CAPRI to Aniceto for joining us this evening, and to the EU for their tremendous and sustained support of the work we do. Thank you to our panelists, Wayne Chen and Michaela Ann Urquhart. This was Yentel's first go at moderating a panel discussion and Ronaldo's first time presenting a report. Congratulations and thanks to them both. There are several good corporate citizens who support CAPRI's work in the public interest. Without them, we would not be able to do our part to contributing to stronger, more transparent democratic governance in Jamaica, and we are ever grateful for their confidence in us. Finally, we appreciate you, our virtual audience, for tuning in and participating in the discussion. We encourage you to follow us on the social media platforms that you frequent, whether that be Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or Twitter. There you can learn more about the work we do and get updates about our events. Today's report may be found on our website, capricaribbean.org. We do hope that you will join us at our next report launch, the third and final in this series of studies on the care economy, in February. See you then, and have a wonderful evening.